Greetings, Pathfinders, and welcome to Absalom Archives History. Today on Issue 2, we'll be covering Thassilon. An ancient civilization that once controlled most of Avestan, Thassilon is very important to Galarian's history, both past and present. A common thing you'll see in fantasy is the advanced ancient civilization, precursors whose wondrous magic and miraculous creations can't be reproduced in modern day. Plato's Atlantis, the Titans from Warcraft, the Netherese from D&D's Forgotten Realms, all these are good examples of the kind of thing we're talking about. Pathfinder has several ancient civilizations, each with varying levels of current-day relevance. Thassilon is the first one players are going to experience, and it has remained important throughout Pathfinder's entire history. Quick note on spoilers. This video will contain information from the adventure paths Rise of the Runelords, Shattered Star, Wrath of the Righteous, and Return of the Runelords. Nothing major for any campaign plots, but still enough to warn you about. Consult your GM or watch at your own risk. That done, let's get started with the history of Thassilon. Now, if you watched the last history video, you might be wondering why we're starting with Thassilon. After all, their history is tied into an even older empire, the Aslanti. But while the Aslanti are the older civilization, Thassilon is more relevant to our early lore, so it gets to skip the line. We will briefly touch on Aslant though, just to provide the proper context. Arrogant almost feels too small for the Aslanti, especially at the height of their power. They could do anything they wanted just by wanting to do it. From their position of superiority, they looked down on the world. Contempt and disdain were the norm, indifference the best you could hope for. There was nothing these others could produce that could ever match up to what an Aslanti did. To consider them equals was unthinkable. To believe they could do better, impossible. But no culture is a monolith. Aslant had its share of people willing to take a risk, and one of them was a man named Xin. Born to a prominent noble family and trained in Aslanti wizardry from a young age, Xin easily mastered everything his teachers brought before him. With that mastery came boredom. Feeling stifled by traditional magic, he abandoned his lessons and set out into the world, searching for more. Traveling east to the continent of Avestan, Xin found a myriad of new magics to study. From the elves he learned crystal magic, from the nomadic Varisians he learned divination and star studies, and from the Shoanti tribes he learned powerful war runes. Those are their modern-day names. In the past, they would have been known by something different, but just for continuity's sake, we'll let you know what they would have been called currently. Through studying these inferior cultures, he even managed to crack the glyph magic of the Algathu, contributing to the discovery of their meddling in Aslanti history. When Xin returned to Aslant, he started speaking about what he'd learned. This attracted a large following of young students and cultural rebels interested in his ideas. Combining everything he had learned together, Xin developed a new form of wizardry. While he would pull aspects from all the cultures he'd studied, the main basis of this system would be the Aslanti virtues of rule. Xin's radical ideas eventually forced the Aslanti ruling class to take action. They probably would have preferred to just kill him, but he was too strong for that to easily happen. Instead, they gave him a choice. He can abandon his new ideas and fall in line, which would let him remain in Aslant, or he could leave the continent, exiled to live among the inferiors he loved so much. Xin picked exile without a second thought. This exile began in -6533, and it would take 3 years for Xin and his followers to arrive on Avestan. After landing, they worked to settle the area, establishing the capital of Bakrakhan. This began the Thassilonian tradition of adding the prefix Xin to the names of their major cities. The new nation would quickly expand to cover most of northern Avestan. Xin based his empire on an interconnected system of magic, faith, and philosophy. The heart of it revolved around the goddess Lysala. On Aslant, her worship was small, eclipsed by the god of magic Amaznan. But Xin was a fervent member of her cult and brought her worship to Thassilon. Here it thrived, growing along with the new nation. Her religious symbol, a 7-pointed star called the Scythe, would quickly become the symbol of Thassilon. To Xin, the Scythe was the perfect embodiment of his ideals, tying together so many separate ideas in one image. 7 schools of magic, 7 virtues of rule, 7 rare sky metals. All of these he unified together with the Scythe. And I don't just mean that philosophically. Xin's ultimate achievement in magical crafting was a powerful artifact shaped like a Scythe and forged from 7 separate star metals. Though perhaps he used up all his genius making it, since Xin ultimately called the artifact simply the Scythe. For the sake of clarity, it will be referred to as the Scythe star for the rest of this video to differentiate the artifact from the symbol it's made to look like. The ideology behind the Scythe and Thassilonian magic seemed to drive much of Xin's decision-making as he grew older. 7 distinct virtues with 7 aspects of magic combined together into a more powerful unified whole. At the same time, Xin had grown tired of the more tedious aspects of ruling an empire. Wanting to retire to more scholarly pursuits and magical study, Xin made a fateful decision. He divided up his empire into 7 distinct territories and appointed 7 of his apprentices to rule each territory. These 7 were all masters of one aspect of Thassilonian magic and, Xin believed, would embody the virtue of rule most associated with that magic. This would create a nation that was like the Scythe star itself, disparate pieces melded together to create something greater than its component parts. Everything went horribly wrong, of course, but before we can talk about how, we need to touch on something a little more metatextual regarding Thassilonian history. When the Pathfinder 2nd Edition remaster was released, it changed a lot of things about how wizards worked in order to remove connections to the Dungeons & Dragons OGL. One of these things was the school a spell belonged to. Prior to this, Pathfinder used the same spell school system that D&D used, having abjuration, conjuration, divination, enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation as its schools of magic. Every spell would fall under one of these schools, and a wizard could either specialize in one school or remain a generalist. The lore of Thassilon, the Runelords, and Xin were all heavily tied into these magical schools. At the time of this writing, there hasn't been any update to the Thassilonian lore or accompanying mechanics of the game to address this difference. For the sake of clarity, these older spell school mechanics will be referred to as historical spell schools. As one final note, people who can count might notice that there are actually 8 schools. Thassilon didn't fully acknowledge divination as a separate spell school. Instead, it was considered a generalist magic every wizard could access. It's very likely that Lasala's divine purview regarding fate had something to do with this, though that's just speculation on my part. With that out of the way, let's get back to the fall of an empire. Xin's intention was for each Runelord to embody a historical school of magic and its associated virtue of rule. These virtues and their associated historical school are generosity for transmutation, love for enchantment, charity for abjuration, humility for illusion, temperance for necromancy, kindness for evocation, and zeal for conjuration. Because each virtue had an associated rune, these rulers would be known as Runelords. Following their appointment, Xin entered seclusion and retirement to continue his work. In retrospect, he probably should have looked a little more closely to see if these apprentices actually embodied the virtues he wanted them to show. It would be disingenuous to say that the Runelords immediately sank into sin, debauchery, and tyrannical rule as soon as Xin retreated from public life, but it did happen incredibly fast. Xin's isolation and age meant that he was largely ignorant of what was happening in Thassilon after his retirement. While Thassilon remained united on paper, in practice the 7 territories functioned as their own nations under control of their respective Runelords. The only thing keeping the Runelords from absolute power was Xin himself. While he was older, frailer, and less mentally acute than when he was in his prime, he was still a powerful wizard in possession of a magical artifact. Though he lacked the ability to take back his empire from the Runelords, they couldn't assault his stronghold either so long as he held the Scythe star. This artifact proved to be the linchpin of Xin's protection and the ultimate source of his downfall. Xin had gotten paranoid as he aged, not helped by the fact that the Runelords were legitimately attempting to assassinate him. He replaced the people around him with clockwork servants whose precision and loyalty he could be sure of. His grandest project was a clockwork reliquary in which he would house his soul, allowing him eternal stewardship over his empire and giving him the means to rein in his wayward Runelords. But in order to fully transfer his soul into the reliquary, he would need to break down the Scythe star into its component parts to use in the ritual. The Runelords saw this as their chance and struck, sending an assassin to kill Xin. The end result was the destruction of Xin's palace and the presumed death of the Emperor. Xin's oldest son was placed on the throne to act as a puppet ruler while the Runelords took control of their own territories. Thassilon had fallen from a bastion of virtue to an empire of sin. Now what truly happened to Xin is a story for another time. From now until Earthfall, Thassilon belongs to the Runelords. Now this might be a bit shocking for a group of people defined by association with deadly sins, but the Runelords didn't exactly get along. With their only controlling influence gone, they immediately began fighting one another for control of the Empire. Ironically, Xin's idea of balancing magical forces against one another also applied here, since no Runelord was able to amass enough power to overcome the other 6. Their rivalry never went away, but open conflict dwindled more and more as it became clear it was a waste of power and resources. Eventually, the Runelords would settle most conflicts with contests of champions instead of open war. Which transitions nicely to our last bit of bookkeeping before we go over all the Runelords. Each territory in Thassilon had a few shared trappings, kind of like how states in America will have a state bird or flower or Dorito flavor. I'll give a brief overview of these now and go more in depth at the end of each region's section. First up, let's talk about those contests of champions I just mentioned. Those were fought with a group of artifacts tied to the Runelords called the Alara High, the 7 Swords of Sin. The first of these was created in -6360 AR, when a Runelord and his son fought to the death, the only remains of the fight being the Sword of Envy. The Runelords established a neutral laboratory called the Rune Forge shortly thereafter, which would produce 6 more swords over time. Complementing the Alara High were the Alara Quinn, a matched set of polearms fashioned by Xin to serve as a weapon of office for the Runelords. After Xin's death, the Runelords would enchant and enhance these weapons to act as tools of domination. All of them are now powerful, intelligent artifacts, their minds as corrupt as their masters. The final grouping of 7 associated with the Runelords are the Star Metals. Technically referring to any kind of metal not normally found on terrestrial Galarian, the ones associated with the Runelords are the most common ones, though common is relative here, as every star metal is incredibly rare compared to common material like iron. Xin used the star metal associated with each school of magic to create a point of his Scythe star. This fully cemented their association with the corresponding Sin and Runelord. Something that wasn't universal but still needs to be talked about are the Rune Wells. Originally created by the Runelord of Lust based on a more powerful artifact, these magic pools provided a variety of benefits. The Rune Wells could absorb magical energy from souls aligned to the Runelord's associated sin, which gave the Runelord a renewable source of power to draw from. It also gave them a reason to continue sliding further and further into that associated sin. Unlike the other items we've covered here, the Rune Wells aren't unique. Many were spread all across Thassilon and tied with their region's sin. For the common people of Thassilon, none of this truly mattered. Their common connection to the Runelords was control. Thassilon's upper class heavily exploited the commoners, using a caste system throughout the empire that separated the elite from their lessers. The largest group, in a very literal sense, were the various giant tribes native to the area. Using magic to control physically stronger creatures is nothing new for wizards, but Thassilon took it to another level. Just before Xin's death, the Runelords created a creature called a rune giant. These powerful servants were covered in runic markings that allowed them to enslave other giants. Acting as loyal masters to their enslaved cousins, the rune giants would assure control over this powerful labor force. Thanks to this, Thassilon was able to build massive monuments and cities that still dot the landscape to this day. While the rune giants controlled the monsters, old-fashioned human cruelty controlled the rest. Thassilon's constant hostility between each territory meant that every runelord needed a standing army, which was composed mostly of conscripted slaves. These conscripts formed a warrior caste whose descendants would go on to become the Shoanti in modern times. Other worker castes would become the modern-day Varisians, but we don't know for sure what role they occupied in Thassilonian society. Thassilon also had a small population of elves and halflings, though their numbers were much smaller than that of humans. Elves were largely captured from the neighboring nation of Mirani, while halflings either migrated with the humans from Aslant or came from somewhere else. These halflings, the Othaban, are considered the ancestors of most modern halflings, though their distinct culture died with Thassilon. It's important to remember that prior to Earthfall, there were no dwarves or orcs above ground, and the gnomes had not migrated from the First World yet, so humans, elves, and halflings were the predominant ancestries across much of the surface. There's also no record of goblins, which I just find funny. Imagine a runelord waking up from stasis, seeing a goblin and going, "Oh my god, what did they do to the halflings?" Alright, we've got all the setup done. It's time to go over the Runelords themselves and their associated territories. Being a Runelord was usually a lifelong position, with retirement coming swiftly at the violent hands of your replacement. 2 of the original Runelords remained in power throughout Thassilon's entire history, but the other 5 were replaced numerous times. We're going to go territory by territory, discussing their Runelord and known history in alphabetical order, which means our first stop is the territory of Bakrakhan, the Realm of Wrath. Bakrakhan, the Realm of Wrath. Bakrakhan was located on the western border of Thassilon, and little of it remains to the present day. The original Runelord of Bakrakhan was a man named Alderpash, whose reign began in negative 6480 Absalom reckoning. Having mastered the historical spell school of Evocation, Alderpash was one of the most overtly powerful of the Runelords. Evocation was the school of lightning bolts and fireballs, the most obvious and spectacular manifestations of magic, but also the least discriminating. Fireballs don't take the time to determine friend from foe, after all. Alderpash's Sin of Wrath greatly enhanced this flaw, his temper and volatility causing him to backstab and turn on allies at a whim. It's also a bit limiting in what you can accomplish. When all you have is an explosive, it's hard to build anything but craters. Alderpash would eventually fall behind his rivals and turn to external sources to augment his power. He made a deal with the demon lord Baphomet, offering the soul of another runelord in exchange for great demonic power. Unfortunately, Alderpash wasn't able to make good on that deal and was imprisoned in Baphomet's Ivory Labyrinth realm instead. In a funny twist, Alderpash's successor would also turn to demonic patrons to seize power, with arguably a little bit more success. Following Alderpash as Runelord of Wrath was Angothane, whose rise to power was assisted by the demon lord Nocticula. His rule began in negative 6266 AR. Like his predecessor, he would also owe his downfall to his abyssal patron. Nocticula would use him as a puppet against another rival runelord who was also serving one of Nocticula's rivals. Angothane's assassination of that runelord allowed Nocticula to pull off a grander demonic killing of her own, though Thassilon nearly plunged into open civil war as a result. Only Angothane's death at the hands of Xandergul, the runelord of Pride, prevented an all-out war. This would spark a greater period of hostility between the realms of Thassilon and prompt the eventual creation of the Alara High to allow for contests of champions. Angothane's fate somewhat mirrors Alderpash's, as his soul wound up in Nocticula's domain following his death. Unlike his predecessor, Angothane was rewarded for his service, being transformed into a powerful Balor demon who still serves his patron to this day. In negative 6150, the third Runelord of Wrath took over. Her name was Zyren, and we don't really know much about her. The only concrete facts we have are that she took the position and when she lost it to assassination. In negative 5905, Thybodos killed Zyren and assumed her position, which he held until negative 5770. We know only a little more about Thybodos, all of it after his defeat by the final person to hold the Runelord of Wrath position, Alasnast. Alasnast was born to a noble house in the capital of Bakrakhan named Xin-Bakrakhan. All the capitals followed that naming convention, by the way, so I'll try to avoid repeating them like I just did there. She was apprenticed to her father, who himself was a powerful wizard. She quickly outstripped him in power, and so she decided to do what the previous Runelord of Wrath did and turn to the Abyss for additional help. Unlike the others though, Alasnus reached deeper. The demons were not the first creatures to roam the abyss, and their lords were not the pinnacle of power. Yamasoth was its name. It was an ancient alien outsider known as a Qlipoth, and not just any, but a lord among their kind. Alasnus' father warned her of the dangers that come with these kinds of dealings and urged her to reconsider. All she heard was, "I volunteer as tribute, darling." Yamasoth's patronage gave Alasnus a lot of advantages. Beneath the streets of Bakrakhan, tunnels extended down into a Darklands cavern called Gongorina, which Yamasoth used as a laboratory on Galarian. Alasnus would send down sacrifices and get back flesh-warped monsters bent to her will. This gave her the physical power base to challenge Thaibados, now she just needed intel. To do this, she traveled to Baphomet's labyrinth and sought out the imprisoned Alderpash, who had transitioned into an undead lich in his time there. Naturally, being two wizards aligned towards wrath, they had a nice civil conversation with no heated exchanges whatsoever. No, obviously they fought. Alasnus won and mounted Alderpash's skull on her rancer as a trophy. The fact that he could grow a new one from his soul jar didn't make the loss sting any less. Alasnus made her move in -5779, killing Thaibados' wife and his 7 children before transforming him into an undead creature. She locked him under Bakrakhan in a place that would come to be known as Hollow Mountain. He's supposedly still there to this day, cursed to be unable to pass on until he finds a way to apologize to his predecessor Zyron for killing her, an act Alasnus believes to be completely impossible. Alasnus ruled until Thassilon fell and was, fitting of her sin, a very aggressive Runelord. Her aggression was largely focused on Shalast, her closest neighboring territory. Sources say she may have even verged on victory when Earthfall brought everything to a screaming halt. Alasnus survived by using her Rune Wells to create a demiplane called the Eye of Fury, where she retreated to wait out Earthfall. The devastation across Thassilon damaged or depowered many of the Rune Wells, cutting off the Eye of Fury from the material universe. This trapped Alasnus inside in a form of stasis. There are still Rune Wells capable of powering the Eye dotting the landscape, and if they can be repowered, then it's possible that Alasnus might one day be freed. Alasnus' Alara Quinn was a rancher, adorned with Alderpash's skull. Made of adamantine, magically sharp, and capable of storing and casting spells on its own, Alasnus' Hateful Rancer complemented their Runelord well. Like the other Alara Quinn, the Hateful Rancer was capable of casting defensive and healing spells to augment and protect its Runelord. This ability may have been particularly useful to Alasnus, since her specific specialization prevented her from casting those kinds of spells herself. And given the explosive backlash her spells could have, extra protection would always be greatly appreciated. Speaking of backlash, the Alara High of Bakrakhan was known as Garvok, the Sword of Wrath. It got its name from its first user, a Shawanti gladiator. Garvok is a crimson greatsword that is enhanced not for melee striking but for throwing. The thrown sword explodes in a burst of fire before reforming in its user's hands. It will also just sometimes explode while in its user's hands, seemingly at random. The user of the sword is not immune to any part of this effect, and most wielders die because of this spontaneous explosion, Garvok being the first. When he died, some of his personality and intelligence was absorbed into the sword, something that hasn't happened with any user since. Garvok, like all the Alara High, is currently dormant while its associated Runelord is away, which greatly diminishes its power. While it is still an adamantine weapon that can be thrown and retrieved magically, none of the more powerful effects function. This is true of all of them, and so this is the only time I'll be making note of it, but if the Runelords ever do return, the swords will return to their full power as well. Finally, the star metal associated with the Runelord of Wrath is Scythe. You might be thinking adamantine because both the Rancer and sword are made of it, but no. Scythe is a unique metal that seems to occur in one of 2 varieties, either hot or cold, at random. Both types of metal can be used to augment the casting of evocation-based spells. This wraps up the Realm of Wrath, which means it's time to move on to Cyrusian, the Realm of Pride. Cyrusian, the Realm of Pride. Cyrusian was the northernmost territory of Thassilon, stretching into what would now be considered the lands of the Linorm kings. The second largest territory in the Empire, Cyrusian's position made it a central hub for all of Thassilon. Extravagance defined Cyrusian more than anything. It had the most cities, the most monuments, the most grand and wonderful sights the Empire had to offer. A jeweled crown of splendor for a land of sin without compare. So in theory, the Runelords were equals. Each was a single part of a greater whole, a single point on the 7-armed Sihedron star. But everyone knows that's not really true. Even among equals, there's a first. Zandergul was the first, and only, Runelord of Pride. From the day he was appointed until Earthfall, he led from Xin-Cyrusian. You could make a case that Zandergul was the closest person to an emperor Thassilon had after Xin's death. A master of the historical spell school of illusion, Zandergul might seem on paper to be the weakest Runelord. After all, there's little raw power in illusions compared to devastating fireballs and conjured horrors from beyond. But that kind of power is like a hammer, making you think of every problem as a nail. Illusions are more subtle, but when you're strong enough to turn your perception into reality, the world is literally what you make of it. Illusions may be subtle, but Xandergul was not. An incredibly extravagant man, he held himself apart from and above the other Runelords. He used the softer power of diplomacy and negotiation to keep the rest of the Empire in line and vaguely together, though he was not above bringing his foot down if he felt it was necessary. One such time was in negative 6150, when he killed 3 other Runelords that threatened to plunge the Empire into a full civil war. None of the other Runelords would agree, but it's clear that in his mind, Xandergul truly ruled Thassilon. Xandergul and Xin-Eurythnia were heavily associated with peacocks during Thassilon's time. Xandergul claimed to have discovered information about an obscure demigod known only as the Peacock Spirit. Though the cult was widespread during Thassilon's time, most of their rites and rituals remained highly secretive. Xandergul was incredibly involved in the cult, building several temples and monuments to the Peacock Spirit and founding at least 2 orders in service of the cult. In negative 6155, as a response to the building of another grand temple of the Peacock Spirit in the nearby region of Haruka, he began construction on the Castle of the Green Feather. This gigantic complex would outshine any other location, proving to everyone that anything they could do, Xin-Eurythnia could do better. This pride even affected Xandergul's plans for his own salvation. While most of the other Runelords were crafting demi-planes using their Rune Wells, he refused to do so. After all, a different Runelord had perfected those, and he would not and could not stoop to using someone else's work. Instead, he would make his own demi-plane, a better demi-plane. He would craft a sanctum for his most loyal and devoted and use the artifact called the Scepter of Ages to travel it forward in time to avoid destruction. All he needed to do was find that scepter, which would be a trivial task for one as powerful and wise as him. So when he didn't find it in time, he settled on a plan B. Retreating into his demi-plane and entering suspension, Xandergul activated a timer, a simple yet elegant solution that would awaken him after 100 years of suspension. Long enough to avoid the major disaster, but soon enough that the people wouldn't have forgotten him or the grandeur of Thassilon. Unfortunately, the failure of another Runelord's Rune Well complicated things. Their followers attempted to raid Xandergul's strongholds to find a fix, which resulted in both themselves and Xandergul's timer being destroyed. Now he's not only trapped outside of reality in stasis, but with no backup left to wake him and no connection to the Rune Wells to possibly kickstart things, the most prideful and powerful Runelord is also the most effectively trapped. Xandergul's Alara Quinn was a Lucerne hammer, humbly titled Xandergul's Flawless Hammer. Made of an unknown sky metal, not one of the 7 commonly associated with the Runelords, the hammer appears instead to be made of simple common iron. The full extent of its powers aren't fully known, but at minimum it was able to ignore illusions and concealment while striking foes, as well as hitting with maximum force every time. Like the other Alara Quinn, it was intelligent, though the mind inside was said to be a simple copy of Xandergul's own mind. The Alara High of Xin-Eurythnia was Bakrakhan, the Sword of Pride. The sword is a rapier with an incredibly ornate basket hilt made of either glass or some kind of crystal. As for the blade, well, that's invisible. Named for a powerful celestial who Xandergul coerced and manipulated into serving as his champion, Bakrakhan is a dangerous tool in the hands of any fighter, but is incredibly dangerous in the hands of a master. Blisteringly fast and with no blade to follow with the eyes, guarding against it is nearly impossible. Finally, the sky metal associated with Xin-Eurythnia is Horicalcum. The rarest of the 7 sky metals, Horicalcum is a dull copper color with the weight and density of steel but far more durable. The metal has a strange property on the local space-time, speeding up or slowing down objects it's made of. Xin-Eurythnia was the ultimate illusion, the glitz and glamour of a decadent empire that was only held together by the unchallenged power and ego of one man. Beneath that illusion was a place of oppression, slavery, and rampant societal problems. Illusions are about what you choose to see and choose not to see, and Xandergul was a master of perception, both others and his own. To those that only saw the surface, this realm was a jewel, the envy of all others, which is a perfect comparison for our next stop. Edasseril, Realm of Envy. Which leads us into Edasseril, the Realm of Envy. Located on the northwestern edge of the Empire, much of it is now located underwater. During Thassilon's prime, it was a realm rich in many natural resources, but many of these resources were contested. Most notably was the Mirani Forest, a location rich in timber that was also home to the elven nation of Mirani. The first Runelord was somewhat obsessed with the location and the elves living there, going so far as to name Edasseril after an elven princess. The various Runelords of Edasseril would attempt to expand their realm, but geographically there wasn't much they could do. Mirani was the only foreign nation they bordered, and their own magic and knowledge of the terrain meant that it was a tough nut to crack. The only thing to the north was a largely empty tundra, and expanding east meant challenging Xandergul or the current Runelord of Wrath, both of which were a bad matchup. Expansion at all was something of a bad match for Edasseril, since the historical spell school associated with Envy was Abjuration. Abjuration spells are highly defensive and protective in nature, which makes them very good at countering other magic users and protecting things, but not so good at combat. Additionally, the realm's leadership and upper class were incredibly mired in petty squabbles and rivalries, which prevented much from getting done. A rational kind of ruler might try to leverage their nation's strengths to produce a stable, well-supplied, and well-structured small kingdom, but these are the Runelords we're talking about, so of course they did the opposite. Being a position built on envy, you'd probably guess that there were a lot of people gunning for the title of Runelord in Edasseril, and you would be correct. Edasseril has the distinction of having the most people to hold the title of Runelord, with 10 separate people holding that title. The first one was named Naft, and very little is known about them. We know he named the realm after an elven princess, and that he was killed in -6442 by his replacement, Tanaris. Notably, Naft was not the first Runelord to be usurped, nor was he the one with the shortest period of rule, so he at least has that to keep his soul content. Tanaris reigned from -6442 to -6360. His only real claim to fame occurred when he died. A very jealous man, Tanaris' envy towards people who had mastered skills that he hadn't pursued was legendary. In an attempt to deal with this, he had his first son, also named Tanaris, trained to be a master swordsman. Tanaris Jr. excelled at this, becoming his father's highly loyal bodyguard wielding a powerful magical bastard sword. Now that's a little bit of irony. Now this might come as a shock, but the guy who killed his way into a position that embodied the sin of envy did not actually process his son's success in a healthy manner. Eventually, Tanaris Sr. snapped and attacked his child, who fought back against his father, martial might against magic power. The fight ended with both dead, the sword having absorbed the personality of someone named Tanaris. If it was the father, son, or a strange mix of both, nobody knows. But this is the backstory that led to the creation of the first Alara High, the Sword of Envy. The next several Runelords of Envy are going to be rapid-fired, since the only thing we know about them are their names and the years they ruled. Start the clock in 3, 2, 1, let's jam. Following Tanaris was Ivamura, who ruled from -6360 to -6301. She was killed by invading Aslanti and replaced by Jura, who reigned from -6301 to -6150. After him was Shalsarda, who was in charge from -6150 to -5966. Next up is Asedria, who ran things from -5986 to -5796. She was succeeded by Zarva, who sat on the throne from -5796 to -5696. A nice round 100 years. He was forcibly removed by Desamelia, who steered the realm from -5696 to -5489. And since we have actual information on the next Runelord, thus ends our lightning round. Wasn't that a riveting list of names and dates? It sure was, and if you disagree, you're wrong, shut up. In -5489, Ferrandi took the title of Runelord. We don't know much about his time as Runelord, but we do know how complicit he was in his own downfall. Edasseril was highly dependent on bureaucracy, and the Runelord had several different apprentices working under them to help run it. Ferrandi took on a promising young bureaucrat named Belmarius as one such apprentice. A cunning and devious woman, Belmarius systematically poisoned and eliminated the other apprentices while also undermining Ferrandi's own magical protections and wards. She finally struck in -5402, imprisoning Ferrandi in a transparent coffin of force and placing him on display in her throne room until his death at some point during her rule. Belmarius was the final Runelord of Envy prior to Earthfall and was, in some way, the best one. Though she always wanted to study magic, she had been initially rejected and was instead consigned to being a local bureaucrat and tax collector. While still learning magic when she could, Belmarius became a master at working through the tangled web of interconnected systems that made up the government of Edasseril. Before and after taking power, she was a constant schemer, always plotting against people who meant her harm and using assassination and poison to do her dirty work. She was also ruthlessly efficient, and this combination actually made Edasseril the most prosperous it had ever been during Thassilon's time. Of course, that was internally. Externally, the other Runelords were largely dismissive of Belmarius. She was the youngest of the group and geographically isolated. The Runelords of Wrath, Pride, Greed, and Lust were all more powerful than her, and their realms stood between her and the realms of Gluttony and Sloth, which were more comparable to her in terms of power. This lack of strength and connection would be what brought about her downfall when the Starstone finally came falling. Not every Runelord was capable of creating a rune well. Belmarius lacked the understanding and pure magical knowledge to do it herself, and didn't have the time needed to rectify that. Instead, she decided to capitalize on the sins of others and simply pay the Runelord of Greed, Karzug, to make one for her. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might think this would result in him betraying her. And you'd be right, he absolutely gave her bad advice that resulted in her rune well malfunctioning. Belmarius had intended to scrutinize the work more closely, but simply ran out of time. The failure didn't just kill everyone, instead doing something more interesting. The entire city of Xin-Edasseril was trapped in a large crystal sphere that left the interior trapped in a constant week-long time loop, where it remains to this day. While outsiders can see into the sphere, no one inside can see out, and neither side can travel in or out. This means that the Realm of Envy is both the most completely sealed off slice of Thassilon remaining, but also the most well preserved. Belmarius Alara Quinn was a halberd known as the Invidious Halberd. Xin originally created this Alara Quinn to act as a balance against the other Runelords. Since the historical spell school of Abjuration focused on protection and dispelling, the halberd was meant to act as a check on the arcane power the other Runelords held. After generations of corrupt wielders, the intelligence inside the halberd has been warped by self-loathing, turning against all magic users except the rightful Runelord who wields it, and even they are only begrudgingly accepted. Made of mithril, the halberd is capable of dispelling magical effects with precise strikes, as well as stealing the spells of any magic user unable to resist its effects. It can even store and release that spell for its user if it so wishes. The Alara High we've touched on already when discussing Runelord Tenaris, so we'll skip the history and just go over the powers we know about. The sword is somewhat simple in its effects, being enchanted to provide strong offense and defensive bonuses to the user. It also attempts to strip away any kind of spell affecting the people it hits, either one at a time or all at once if the user is lucky enough. It also has the usual complement of minor healing and protection spells all the swords possess. Notably, Tenaris was trapped inside Xin-Edasseril with its Runelord, which means it never went dormant alongside the other Alara High. Finally, the associated sky metal for Envy is Noqual. A metal that resembles a pale green crystal, Noqual can be worked just like iron. It has all the durability of iron, but only a third of the weight. It's also highly resistant to magic. It is possible to enchant Noqual, but it requires a long, expensive alchemical process to do so. It's easy for Envy to influence someone. Seeing what others have and wanting it, but not being able to get it, can eat away at you. That small voice that says if you had their power, their resources, their luck, you could have been powerful too. It's all about desire for what you want, which is something it has in common with our next region, the Realm of Lust. Eurythnia, the Realm of Lust. Eurythnia was located on the southern Thassilonian coast and was responsible for most of the foreign trade the nation saw. Greed accumulates wealth, but desire is what moves it, and if there's one thing that's always sold well, it's sex. Eurythnia was a place where you could find anything or anyone to satisfy you and could make a few glittering bits of gold selling yourself off. Not every delight was the consensual kind though, and Eurythnia had a large population of slaves brought in to satisfy the darker desires of the people living there. Their taste for foreign goods was also quite literal, with the spice trade allowing culinary delights to be indulged as easily as any other. The traditional spell school associated with lust is enchantment. Focused on charm, domination, and control, you can easily see how someone with little self-control and an excess of desire could use their magic to indulge every twisted whim imaginable. However, enchantment also needs to be subtle, since obvious manipulations are easier to break and cause much more dangerous feelings of resentment in the person being controlled. It's a softer kind of power, and Runelord Sorshan was a master at walking this line. Sorshan was the only person to hold the title of Runelord of Lust. Fitting her particular magic, the influences she had politically were subtle and understated, which unfortunately means very little record of them survives to the present day. Her magical research and discoveries are another matter though, with Sorshan's creations being almost directly responsible for the Runelords surviving at all. Using a powerful artifact called the Everdawn Pool, Sorshan was able to create a lesser version of it that could be attuned to specific vices in a person's soul. These were the first Rune Wells, and, in a decision she would come to regret, Sorshan shared the knowledge of creating them with the other Runelords. Not every Runelord was capable of creating one, but many of them were able to figure it out and spread them throughout their realm, giving each Runelord a readily available source of power. During Thassilon's time, Sorshan commissioned many works of art depicting her, many of them large, full-body statues. She also ordered the construction of a large lighthouse that would become known as Lady's Light on the eastern coast of her domain. This was a very lucky placement, since Earthfall destroyed much of the land immediately south of its location, placing the lighthouse along the entrance to the inner sea. Lady's Light would be the only one of Sorshan's projects to completely survive, with many of the statues being destroyed. The largest remnant is simply a base with Sorshan's feet, the rest of the statue destroyed or repurposed prior. There's a feet pics joke in there somewhere, but I won't make it since we're already towing the line of decency here. Since she invented them, it's pretty obvious that Sorshan was going to use her rune well to survive Earthfall. She constructed a demiplane called the Eye of Desire below her palace and set up an elaborate system of traps and prisons designed to siphon blood from a variety of creatures to slowly return her to life after the worst had passed. Guarded by a clan of loyal vampires, this vault should have been secure and well designed enough to see Sorshan awaken on time. We don't know what entirely went wrong, but something did, and Sorshan remains as trapped in her demiplane as the rest of the Runelords. The Alara Queen of Eurythnia was called Sorshan's sinuous Guisarm. Say that 5 times fast. Magically sharp and quick, the polearm holds a blade at both ends for fast, precise cuts. Uniquely, the Guisarm can also transform itself into a magical staff of enchantment, giving its user additional spellcasting support. The weapon was also designed to assist in fighting non-spellcasters, bolstering the user's luck when in combat against almost any general threat. The intelligence within the Guisarm was crafted using magical gems filled with 13 of Sorshan's most salacious dreams and desires, given to Xin to empower her weapon. The Alara High of Eurythnia, the Sword of Lust, was constructed with a specific champion in mind. When it was supposed to be presented to him, Sorshan instead stabbed the unnamed champion through the chest, immolating him and leaving the sword stuck inside. She then issued a challenge to everyone present, saying that whoever returned the cleaned blade to her chambers would be considered her champion. The resulting bloodbath lasted a few days, with a foreign woman named Ashia presenting the blade to Sorshan. Ashia served as Sorshan's champion for decades before retiring, the sword now bearing her name. It's unknown if the intelligence inside the sword is based on her or not. The sword's combat powers are somewhat simple, possessing only magical sharpness and the ability to light itself on fire. Defensively, the sword provides complete immunity to any kind of enchantment magic, while allowing the user to fake having been affected. This works even against spells that should notify the caster of their failure, giving the user a unique edge in bluffing their opponents. It's also interesting that Sorshin's sword is much more effective in countering her own specialization rather than other casters. Finally, the sky metal associated with MV is Jezet. This metal is very unique because it's liquid at room temperature like mercury. A rusty red color normally, Jezet is largely unsuited for making weapons or armor due to its liquid property, though it is possible to make an alloy using complicated alchemical processes. Instead, Jezet is largely used for its ability to enhance spells when used in their casting, increasing their rank and effectiveness. Since this magically consumes the Jezet, this sky metal has become progressively rarer as time has gone on. Eurythnia was remarkably stable for a realm of debauchery. A lot of that can be attributed to Sorshin's absolute control. Many other people would have fallen so far into their self-indulgence that the world around them would have simply crumbled, but Sorshin managed to straddle the line between effective ruler and debauched tyrant. When you don't have someone that can manage that, well, that's when you get our next location. Gastash, the realm of gluttony. Okay, so we all have to promise to be very normal about the word Gastash and make as few fart jokes as possible, or at the very least keep them silent but deadly. Okay, for real. We don't actually know a lot about Gastash. It was the easternmost realm of the Empire and only really shared a border with the realm of Greed. It served as the breadbasket of the Empire, growing abundant amounts of food to support both itself and the rest of Thassilon. It might seem a little odd that the realm of Gluttony would be exporting food instead of hoarding it, but if you give it a little thought, it makes a lot of sense. Gluttony isn't just eating, it's excessive consumption. Variety is just as important as quantity, and no mortal appetite is completely endless. When you're dedicated to creating as much food as possible, you're going to have more than you need even after everyone eats their fill. Plus, Gastash had an advantage when it came to their labor force. The historical spell school associated with Gluttony is Necromancy, which might seem mismatched at first. After all, Necromancy is about controlling the dead and raising them into servitude. But, like the farming thing earlier, it also makes a lot of sense if you understand the fundamental nature of undead. Undead aren't supposed to exist. The void energy that animates and controls them is not meant to create, it's a force of entropy and destruction. Using it to create, even if it's an unholy parody of life, makes something wrong. There is something missing from every undead, which gives them all kinds of endless aching hungers. Ghouls eat flesh, vampires drink blood, etc, etc. With that context, it's easy to see why gluttony makes sense for necromancy. The Runelords of Gluttony were all, it can be assumed, highly indulgent people. We don't know very much about them, so we're going to breeze through the first two in a similar fashion to the Envy ones, although there are fewer of them to cover. Starting with the first Runelord of Gluttony, we have Califestra. She ruled Gastash from negative 6480 to negative 6258. She was replaced by Atharend, who reigned until negative 6150 when he was killed by Xandergul. He was succeeded by Athusa, who controlled Gastash from negative 6150 to negative 5822. Remember that name, because we're going to bring it up again later in a different section. And lastly, we have the penultimate Runelord, Goparlis. Now, Goparlis was notable for being the Runelord that had commissioned the Alara High for Gastash. He also never got to use it or even appoint a champion. See, Gastash had a large population of barbarian tribes that were mostly seen as fodder for the Necromancer's experiments and corpse-based needs. During Goparlis' time in charge, one of those barbarians gathered a large following of rebels to fight against the hated Runelords. Named Ungataro, this charismatic leader was known as the Dragon Master, having tamed 2 white dragons to serve as shock troopers and mounts for himself. When he heard that the Alara High had been completed and was on its way to Goparlis, he decided that a raid was in order. Ungataro easily seized the sword and turned it on Goparlis, cutting down anyone sent to get it back. Goparlis became obsessed with getting his sword, ignoring everything else in favor of retrieving it. He even managed to kill Ungataro, but that didn't solve his problem. It actually kinda made it worse. See, this is the realm of the undead after all. Ungataro rose as a Grave Knight, a powerful undead champion who can only be put down if his armor is completely destroyed. Now even stronger and functionally immortal, Ungataro made himself even more of a nuisance. Goparlis' obsession and fury only grew, and his apprentice Xutha capitalized on that. Xutha killed and replaced Goparlis, becoming the last Runelord of Gluttony. In a fun little twist, he was quickly approached by Ungataro with an offer. If Xutha handed over Goparlis' body to him, he'd give back the sword. Xutha made a counteroffer. Keep the sword, get the body, and act as his personal champion from that day on. So the Sword of Gluttony gained the name Ungataro for its champion, who wielded it until Thassilon's collapse. Xutha himself was a unique individual. Like most necromancers, his endgame goal was to transform into a lich, greatly augmenting his magical power. But the problem with being a lich is that the undead can't truly eat or enjoy the finer things in life. Xutha worked hard to circumvent this issue, becoming a unique lich that retained his human sensation and most of his appearance. The downside was he needed a constant influx of life energy to sustain himself, which honestly suited him just fine. Xutha ruled the longest of all the Gluttony Runelords and spent that time stuffing himself on every delight he could find. It was said he never ate the same meal twice. Being a lich gave Xutha a unique advantage in surviving Earthfall. Even if he was destroyed, as long as his soul jar remains intact, he would be able to return. So even though he couldn't construct a rune well or demiplane of his own, he wasn't afraid of the coming calamity. His soul jar took the form of a unique book called the Gluttonous Tome, which itself was divided into 3 separate pieces: the Bone Grimoire, the Black Book, and the Cardossian Codex. These 3 books were entrusted to 3 highly loyal servants, Ungutaro among them, and split up with instructions to bring them together once Earthfall had passed. Xutha then constructed a large pillar of black rock called the Cenotaph, which would store his body inside and await his soul jar's reunification. Now stop me if you've heard this one, but Earthfall proved to be more damaging than the Runelord anticipated. The 3 tomes that made up his soul jar were scattered across Avestan and remain scattered to this day. At some point during the Age of Darkness, Ungutaro was defeated and it's unknown if he still survives, moldering in some ancient tomb. Fitting the necromancy theme, the Alara Quinn of Gluttony is a Scythe. Unlike the others, which had an epithet associated with the weapon, this one is simply known as Xutha's Scythe. Xutha himself didn't use it much, favoring a set of magical rings and stones when forced into combat. Instead, he would lend the scythe out to various favored agents and champions. The scythe was made of hardened sinew and bone instead of metal and could drain the life out of anyone harmed by it, converting it into the void energy nourishing to undead. This made the scythe very deadly to living users, not that Xutha really cared. We've discussed the history of Ungutaro earlier, so there's not much more to say. The falchion carries a copy of Ungutaro's intelligence inside it, added at some point during his life when he died, whether this was his first death as a living person or a death in his Grave Knight form. The blade seems ghostly and translucent, despite being fully solid, allowing it to affect spirits as well as living creatures equally. It can also drain the living energy from a creature to bolster the user, or even slay enemies outright with the correct blow. Dead victims of the sword rise as undead under the user's control, though there are a limited amount it can command before they're simply let loose as feral undead. Lastly, the sky metal associated with necromancy is Inubrix. Also called Ghost Iron, Inubrix is very soft, only just harder than lead. It isn't suitable for armor crafting at all, and weapons made of it are much more fragile than average. The advantage is that Inubrix can completely phase through iron and steel as if it was not there. Though it can't harm anything constructed of these metals, it can't be stopped by them either. Full plate is the same as being fully naked to an Inubrix weapon. Gastash was an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, you had a highly exploited underclass whose bodies were literally used beyond their lifetime to support an upper class with an endless appetite. On the other hand, it was the most comfortable realm to live in for most people there. Gastash stayed out of the wars and feuding of the other realms, and their status as a food producer meant that the areas relying on the living people left them alone. Now, I've decided to get into the spirit of our next realm by being too lazy to write a good transition. Haruka, the realm of Sloth. So now does that old transition make a little bit more sense? Haruka was the smallest realm of Thassilon and was, as you'd probably guess, very lazy. Anyone in power spent their time delegating their responsibility off onto anyone else they could force to do the work. For the non-magical, that meant slaves either taken from within or imported from somewhere else. But for the magical, that meant the historical spell school associated with Sloth, Conjuration. Why do something when you can summon a magical creature that is required by the terms of that magic to do what you want? Interestingly, Haruka was also extremely religious. It's not fully known why it was that way, though if I had to guess, I'd say it has something to do with the most powerful conjured creatures being from the Outer Planes, meaning a greater connection between the wizards of this realm and the servants of deities. In another little twist, one of the most popular religions in the region was the worship of the peacock spirit. The peacock spirit became so popular, in fact, that for a long time, the largest temple dedicated to the god was located in Haruka. Known as Seknivali, it still stands today as one of the few surviving temples to the god. Beyond that, we don't know much about Haruka or its leaders. The first Runelord of Sloth was Zairi, and he served that role for the longest of anyone to hold the title. He was the one that ordered the construction of Seknivali, though he didn't worship the peacock spirit himself. Instead, he was the strongest mortal champion of the demon lord Kolafir. He was assassinated by Nocticula through her pawn Angothane in 6150, which distracted his patron enough to allow Nocticula to kill him. The resulting schism has been covered before a few times, but for Haruka, this would result in a string of new Runelords in relatively quick succession. The second Runelord of Sloth was Iltherius, who ruled from negative 6150 to negative 6105. His only known achievement is being the Runelord who commissioned the creation of his realm's Alara High, the Sword of Sloth. He demanded the creation of the most powerful sword his people could make, but was frustrated with the results and ordered everyone involved in its creation killed. The consequences of that will be covered in the swords section, but it was definitely more useful than Iltherius gave it credit for. Rapid fire for the next four since we only have names and dates. After Iltherius came Azarandi, who ruled from negative 6105 to negative 6008. After him came Zalalet, who ruled from negative 6008 to negative 5847. She was replaced by Krenlith, who ruled Haruka from negative 5847 to negative 5752. Following him was Ivarina, who was in charge from negative 5752 to negative 5525. Finally, she was replaced with Krune, the final Runelord of Sloth. Krune is unique, having inherited his title peacefully from Ivarina, who simply retired instead of being murdered for her position. Honestly, good for her. Krune's reign was largely a peaceful one, though this isn't because he was actually a good ruler or a good person. His laziness and disinterest in most things simply worked out for him and his people. Krune's real passion was in religion. Himself a high-ranking priest in Lasala's church, he pushed back against the worship of the peacock spirit as much as he was able to. That faith was deeply entrenched and had massive backing, but also had an entire empire to spread out to, so these struggles were largely political and relatively bloodless. Like Belmarius and Zutha, Krune wasn't able to build a Rune Well, so he needed a different way to survive Earthfall. Instead, he removed his soul from his body and placed it in an enchanted gem. That gem was sealed in an underground tomb with his body, and the Church of Thassilon was told to wait out Earthfall, conquer a new kingdom for him, and then wake him up to get around to ruling. So yes, his plan was literally to sleep through the problem. But you've heard it 5 times before: Earthfall bigger, plan fails, so on and so forth. The Church of Thassilon barely survives into modern times, and may not even be aware Krune is still slumbering somewhere, awaiting for them to wake him up. The Alara Quinn of Haruka was the dragon-toothed spear, which is generally thought of as the weakest of the ruler's weapons. Partly this is due to its nature encouraging inaction and comfort, rather than attacking or defending the user. In a pinch, Krune's dragon-toothed spear can animate itself to battle attackers, but it prefers to avoid such confrontation. Any additional abilities it might have are unknown. The Alara High we've touched upon is named Xin-Tari, the Sword of Sloth. It initially appeared to simply be a magical sword, well made and powerful to be sure, but not the most powerful weapon that Runelord Eltharius wanted. He conjured a powerful assassin and ordered the creators slaughtered. As they died, they revealed the true power the sword held. Absorbing the minds of those it killed, the sword magically adjusted itself to be more potent and dangerous against anyone it wounded. Suitably impressed, Eltharius ordered the sword to be decorated with the likeness of its creators to honor them. Now personally, I would have preferred a resurrection, but Eltharius didn't go that route, possibly because it would have required him to make multiple sending calls. The sky metal associated with Sloth is Abyssium, which is a glowing dark bluish-green metal. And just like you'd expect from something greenish and glowing, this stuff is basically radioactive. While you can make armor and weapons out of it, anyone using them without proper protection will grow sick and die. The items themselves will also glow unless covered, which can reduce the stealth of anyone using it. Abyssium is more suited for acting as a power source for various arcane constructs, though much of the process for doing so has been lost to time. Haruka was the smallest and honestly least important of the realms of Thassilon. While still a dangerous sin to be consumed by, Sloth is also the least overall damaging because if you aren't doing anything, well then you aren't doing anything. You simply exist, never really expanding. Unlike the last bit of Thassilon we're talking about, where expansion was the name of the game. Shalast, the Realm of Greed. Shalast was the largest of Thassilon's territories. At least, based on the map I could find, there isn't an exact dimension listed anywhere for these territories. If it wasn't, it was definitely second. The most centrally located, with only a small mountainous part of the border not shared with another territory. While the Runelord of Greed would have loved to grab all the surrounding territories, the factors of the situation meant that it only had one real option. Eurythnia and Xin-Eurythnia were simply too strong, their Runelords too powerful. Gastash was too vital, their imported food feeding the army of giants and monsters as well as the slaves that made up most of the labor force. Haruka was too small to be worth it, along with the conjured defenses being highly resilient. And Edasseril was simply on the other side of Xin-Eurythnia, which meant that Bakrakhan was the main target, though warfare didn't really ramp up until the later half of Thassilon's history. The historical spell school associated with greed is transmutation, the art of turning things into other things. The application here is pretty obvious, taking things considered worthless and making something of value out of them. Not just materials, but also the body and the mind. One thing to keep in mind is the old Amestris saying, to obtain something, something of equal value must be lost. Shalast needed a massive underclass of people to facilitate industry and be sacrificed for their value. An interesting thing about Shalast is its relationship with a city that was already there when Thassilon was founded. Discovered by the first Runelord Caladurne, the city was inhabited by a strange group of creatures he named Callborn. These creatures informed him that the city, which was built on a strange hexagonal base of solid stone, was called Kermaga. They claimed to have found the city, not built it, and they inhabited tunnels that ran deep into the ground. These strange creatures fed on memory and thought, and they were capable of making predictions of the future. Caladurne made a deal with them. Shalast would send their criminals and undesired elements to the city, which would act as a prison. The Callborn would feed on them and provide Shalast with prophetic instructions in return. This was a very good deal in the long term, though Caladurne wouldn't have much time to make use of it. Caladurne also discovered a second site during his initial survey of Shalast, high in a local mountain range that would become known as the Kodar Mountains. Called Mahar Masif, this giant mountain was located at a strange area of planar thinness. Here he would establish the capital, as well as a strange religion called the Church of Shalast. Almost nothing survives of this faith except for the name of a temple called the House of Divine Consumption. While he would begin the construction of the capital here, Caladurne wouldn't survive to see it fully finished. Caladurne has the distinction of being the Runelord that spent the least amount of time with this title, holding it for only 32 years. Only 9 of the 37 Runelords ruled for less than 100 years, and only 4 of those for less than 50. His decisions would prove to be very helpful to future Runelords, but they didn't do him much good. He was replaced in negative 6448 by Fethir, who was in turn replaced in negative 6318 by Gimel. Gimel is notable for doing something legendary that no one else ever has, calling the Big Elephant. The year was negative 6301 and Aslan had invaded and killed the current Runelord of Envy. Thassilon marshaled its defenses and Runelord Gimel enacted a powerful ritual. An incredibly powerful creature from another plane called Jondale was called forth. Known as the Oliphant of Jondale, this singular creature was incredibly dangerous and destructive. Gimel managed to control and bind it to his will, allowing the creature to almost single-handedly defeat the invading Aslanti army. Gimel's control wasn't ironclad, and the Oliphant was increasingly called back to its home plane, which helped break the hold. It broke free and turned on Thassilon's forces, defeating about half their legions before returning home. Many other Runelords would attempt to repeat this feat, trying to summon the creature and failing, dying horribly. None have ever managed to match Gimel's feat of will and magic. Gimel ruled for a good time after, Shalast making more advances under him, like discovering how to transmute lead into gold. But he was eventually replaced in negative 6192 by Lignia. She ruled from then until negative 6040, when Masmirana replaced her. Masmirana was the third shortest Runelord to hold office, being overthrown by Ethusa after 43 years. Now if you're clever, and I know you are, you recognize that name. It was also the name of a Runelord of Gluttony who, oddly, held that position at the same time. As far as we know, they are just two different people that share the same name, but it's an interesting coincidence nonetheless. Ethusa was replaced in negative 5862 by Haframa, who was in charge until negative 5759. He would pen a well-known spellbook called the Runes of Wealth. Very little of his history remains due to a concentrated effort by his successor to erase as much of him as possible. This successor was one of his apprentices and the man who would become the Runelord of Greed the longest, Karzug. Karzug was born a slave, the lowest possible position you can have. He was enslaved by a powerful lich named Zinlun, who used and abused the boy until the age of 27. Karzug managed to trick his master into selling him to a cannibal in a fit of petty anger, which Karzug capitalized on. Having learned something of magic from Zinlun, Karzug killed the cannibal who bought him and stole his golden teeth, using them to fund his escape. Karzug then sought out another powerful wizard named Thurbel. A demon summoner and binder, Thurbel would be just as cruel to his apprentice as Zinlun was, possibly even crueler. Thurbel would use Karzug as a literal sacrifice, allowing him to die and be resurrected to buy demonic services. Karzug seethed and hated this, but learned quickly and well. When the time came, he sabotaged his master's ritual and allowed a demon to devour his soul. Karzug then looted the location and used the funds to buy his way into the service of Haframa at the ripe age of 34. He would serve for the next 40+ years, learning transmutation and gaining more power. He also gained a curiosity for the thinness of reality around Mer Massif. Karzug would experiment with the location, eventually making contact with the strange dimension of Lang and its otherworldly inhabitants. He bargained and dealt with them extensively, securing as much support as he could. Haframa discovered Karzug's plots in negative 5802, but it was too late. Karzug murdered his master and took the position of Runelord of Greed. As Runelord, he was a capricious and cruel man, entirely self-focused and willing to enact horrible vengeance on anyone that angered him. His first actions were to systemically erase his past. He razed his hometown to the ground and used the surrounding land as a quarry, taking so much stone that no possible trace remained of people there. He then ordered a nearby river dammed up, creating a lake that exists to this day known as the Storval Deep. Karzug was an ambitious ruler, constantly warring with Bakrakhan to expand his territory. He funded numerous monuments and projects, including the massive Storval Deep Dam and a huge carving of his face on Mar Massif. He also constructed a giant metal arch that would become known as the Cipher Gate. Whatever it was meant for, Karzug never fully finished it before being forced into his demiplane to survive Earthfall. We'll get into his survival in a bit, but I want to do the Polearm Sword and Sky Metal first, so we'll hit those now. The Alara Quinn was Karzug's Burning Glaive, a powerful weapon able to fight on its own and, as you might expect, light on fire. The glaive was largely designed to be self-sufficient in combat, allowing the Runelord to focus on their spells or additional abilities. For example, Karzug was known to use strange claw weapons he obtained from his allies in Leng for his own non-spellcasting needs, rather than the glaive. The Alara High of Shalast was named Chalan and was made of gold. Now normally that's a horrible idea, because gold is incredibly soft, but Shalast had a theme to commit to and damn they were going to do that. The only thing more expensive than solid gold is magically and alchemically treated solid gold, so it still looks like gold but is harder and more dense than steel. This gives it extra heft and striking power in addition to its other properties. Chalan could slow opponents and even turn them to solid crystal on occasion. Though it looks like valuable gemstone, it was actually just colored quartz with very little value. Chalan was named for its first user, a golden construct made by the same people who built the sword because the Runelord of Greed couldn't trust a mortal, fallible champion with something so valuable. The construct's base personality still infuses the blade, giving it intelligence but not as much character as the other Swords of Sin. As for the Sky Metal, the one associated with greed is adamantine. The most well-known Sky Metal, it also has the most obvious use. Adamantine is incredibly hard and durable, able to withstand blows and cut through lesser metals with ease. It's this greater overall utility that makes it so valuable. Every other Sky Metal might be rarer, but their uses were also more niche. Adamantine was something everyone wanted and which couldn't readily be made. Kinda like a Rune Well, actually. Oh yeah, nailed that transition. So Karzug used a Rune Well to survive, just like many of the other Runelords. Inside the Eye of Avarice, he spent time in suspension, waiting for history to pass. Now there is a reason I did Shalast at the end. Yes, these are in alphabetical order, but that's just a lucky coincidence. If it wasn't, I'd still have done this one last. And the reason is that Karzug is the most important Runelord, not for Thassilon, but for our modern day story. See, you might have noticed in the previous segments I talk about the Runelords potentially waking up, being resurrected, or in some way returning. You might also remember I talked about spoilers for something called Rise of the Runelords. Now engage those brains and see if you can follow where I'm going. Yes, Karzug is the first Runelord to return, so it's time to fast forward 10,000 years or so. Well, technically 9,995 if you're being pedantic. Thassilon is a long-forgotten memory, and Karzug's capital city of Xin-Shalast is believed to be a myth. Remnants of the monsters who served under him still inhabit its ruins, but humanity has long abandoned it. In 4702, an exiled stone giant named Makmurian completes a long journey to find those ruins. Oral tradition of their ancient Thassilonian masters has been passed down through the generations, and while other stone giants saw a cautionary tale, Makmurian saw power. Smaller and weaker than others, with his magic also being a wizardly nerd kind instead of an accepted sorcery, Makmurian resented those around him and looked for a way to show all of them how foolish they were to doubt him. Obviously the kind of mind you want locating an ancient evil wizard looking for servants. And locate a wizard he did, as Makmurian found his way to Karzug's tomb. He couldn't fully free Karzug, which would require a lot more power, but he could rouse the old tyrant. Karzug is not a kind and nurturing master. He invaded Makmurian's mind and instilled the giants with feelings of loyalty and obsession. Makmurian would set to his master's work immediately. An army of monsters and stone giants would be assembled and organized, while powerful agents would be dispatched to mortal settlements. There they would mark and harvest the souls of the most greedy people they could find, siphoning the power from them into Karzug's Rune Wells. When enough power can be gathered, the Eye of Avarice would open and return a powerful, tyrannical wizard to a world unprepared to oppose him. 5 years have passed since that time, and the Rune Wells are getting very, very full. Thassilon existed for a relatively short period of time, only a little less than 1,200 years. Their legacy in the Inner Sea, specifically around the region of Varesia, is what gives them such importance. Lost artifacts, ancient sites, and mysterious monuments dot the landscape, providing so many ready-made places for adventure to happen. And with Karzug starting to awaken, there's a ticking clock on the rest of the Runelords being disturbed and allowed to return as well, and while some of them are weaker than him, some of them are also stronger and represent a much greater danger waiting in the wings. Sin as a theme gives you 7 different flavors of evil to use, while their different magics work to highlight the strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of wizards. The geography also helps, with Thassilon being large enough to span a few nations, but not so strong that everything across the continent is connected to them. And there you have it, the basics around Thassilon. There are still a few secrets yet to be revealed about this ancient empire, but those are going to have to remain buried for now. Keep an eye out for anyone marked by a 7-pointed star, and do your best to avoid sin, Pathfinders. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Make sure you do all those YouTube things, and until then, explore, report, and cooperate.